Welcome to the 3A's podcast, Ancestral Health, Austrian Economics, and Awareness Mindfulness, the 3A's. And we're back on the 3A's podcast. After a long hiatus, here is episode 3 with Dr. Randall Holcombe, an economist out of Florida State. We'll be discussing Austrian economics today and how it explains a lot of what's going on in terms of the economic crisis, the power structure, but maybe more importantly, as the title of the show is, Ancestral Austrian Awareness, how it is an interplay with our health, our well-being, and a lot of our interpersonal relationships. So I'd like to ask you at this point to please check out our Twitter page. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, and the newsletter will be coming out on a monthly basis. Please come over to the3as.com and sign up for our newsletter. Without further ado, here is Dr. Randall Holcombe. And hi, welcome to the 3A's podcast. That's Ancestral Austrian Awareness. And our guest today is Dr. Randall Holcombe. He is the Defoe Moore Professor of Economics at Florida State University. He received his PhD in economics at Virginia Tech, taught at Texas A&M, at Auburn University prior to arriving at Florida State in 1998. Dr. Holcombe, thank you for being on the 3A's podcast.
No, thanks for inviting me, Zachary. I'm delighted to have the chance to talk with you.
Well, I've read through several of your works, especially over the last year or so. I would like to discuss with you a little bit today one of your recent pieces, Liberalism and Cronyism, Producing Prosperity. The full title is An Inquiry into the Operation of the Market Process. Before we get started, given the fact that part of your field of study is part of the title of this podcast, what is Austrian economics?
Austrian economics takes a little bit of a different approach to economics than what the Austrian school would sometimes refer to as mainstream economics. Austrian economics tends to focus very much on the market process rather than looking at equilibrium outcomes. Austrian economics is very aware of the limitations of knowledge in economics. So sometimes economists will make assumptions when they develop economic models of perfect information. Everybody knows everything that's going on in the economy. Excuse me, I have a little cough there. And Austrian economists focus on the fact that, in fact, information is fragmented. It's often imperfect. People sometimes have contradictory knowledge. And so the market economy is a mechanism that enables all of this information to be coordinated and to produce desirable economic outcomes. And I will say, one of the big lessons that we get out of Austrian economics, and I think economics in general, is the way that you can get an effective order emerge spontaneously without anybody planning it out. And that's certainly one of the cornerstones of Austrian economics.
Well, as regards that last point, it very much made sense to me that F.A. Hayek's initial field of study was biology. In particular, I think it was neuroscience. He studied the functions of the brain, and the decentralization of biology, I would imagine, perhaps led to his acceptance of Austrian economics and perhaps becoming a disciple. I think that in some ways, from a counter position, allowed me in my study of Austrian economics to understand the decentralization of agricultural production and things like this. So, as regards that, I was reading through one of your recent papers, Liberalism and Cronyism, and you went through a lot of different isms in this paper. And what I found very interesting, of course, is the traditional definition of liberalism, of course, is quite different than what we think of today. Can you please expound upon that a little bit?
Sure. The old conception of liberalism, which is still pretty current in Europe, was that people would engage in each other through voluntary exchange, voluntary transactions, individual freedom. And the modern conception in the United States tends to go the other way, that we think of a liberal society in the modern sense as one where government has a heavy hand and produces regulatory policies, government transfer programs, where people are not engaging each other voluntarily, but rather through the coercion of government. They're being taxed. Some people are being taxed in order to provide subsidies to other people, where people are being regulated. Some people are being regulated for the benefit of others. And really, one of the key ideas that comes through in this is, if you think about the way that individuals ought to treat each other, the way we commonly think, through voluntary, non-coercive means, that we ought to hold the government to those same standards. So, for example, if some homeless person was to come up to you on the street, threaten you with a knife or a gun or something and say, "Give me your money, I want some food," we would think of that as robbery. But with the modern liberal conception of government, when the government comes to you and says through the force of government, "Turn over your tax dollars and we're going to use these tax dollars to buy food for someone else," we don't think of that as robbery, but in the earlier conception of liberalism, we would.
Well, that's a very interesting point. I've spent some time in Europe and the former Soviet Union, and one of the things I remember reading was, comparatively speaking, and perhaps it's gone down in inverse proportion to taxes going up, but the United States has traditionally had the highest rate of charitable giving, whereas in places in Europe and certainly in the Soviet Union, when they were a large portion of their income was taken from them by the state, there was a sense that they had already done their duty in providing that help, to go along with your example, to the homeless man, whereas perhaps in a society where you have more of your fruits of your labor, you might have more to give. Is that something that would go along with what you just said?
Oh, it certainly is. And I mean, when you think about it, one reason why people in Europe and the Soviet Union might have been less charitable is because they're thinking, hey, the government's taking care of these people, so I really don't have an obligation to do that. Whereas if you don't have that government safety net, charitable-minded people who will have more money anyway because it won't be taxed away from them, charitable-minded people will say, I ought to do something to help out people who are less fortunate. But this redistributive state, one of the things that it does is take the opportunity for virtue out of society. Because if you use some of your resources that you could spend on yourself for charitable means, you're giving something up in order to help somebody else. Well, there's some virtue in that. If the recipient is a deserving person, you have the opportunity to engage in some virtuous activity. But there's no virtue in paying taxes. So if it turns out that the way our society is run is that government forces some people to give up some of their income to support others, it takes away the opportunity for virtue. Like I say, there's no virtue in paying taxes. There is virtue in engaging in charitable activity.
Well, when I lived in Central Asia, in the former Soviet Union, for a few years, I saw firsthand the inability of entrepreneurs to expand. It was as if someone getting too big for their britches was really in danger of getting some of their assets stripped away. So there was this kind of balance of wanting to be successful, of needing to have a particular structure that didn't shine a light on you. And it really gave me an understanding of, particularly in corrupt societies where there was a lot of cronyism, that it wasn't that these people were less clever than the U.S. citizens. In fact, in many ways, they were more clever because they had to operate in that type of environment. But it certainly wasn't that much more productive. And I guess that leads to a question of cronyism. I mean, when you do have a society with so much state control, it does lead to cronyism. And could you explain that, not only in a place, let's say in the developing world, but here in the United States as well?
Sure. When you look at the way that people can increase their income, increase their wealth, there are really two basic ways that they can do that: production or predation. They can either be productive and engage in voluntary exchange with people and produce wealth, or through predation, they can take what somebody else has produced. Now, if you have a society where property rights are protected, where rule of law is established, and what I mean by rule of law is there's an objective set of laws that apply to everybody, then the way that you get ahead is to engage in productive activity. If you have a situation where the government allocates a lot of resources, and so the people who are on the inside end up profiting at the expense of people who are outside, then ambitious individuals, instead of engaging in productive activity, they try to figure out, how can I become an insider? How can I be one of those people who is in a position to take from others? Because in that kind of a society of big government, you have a situation where productive individuals end up losing what they're producing, maybe through outright theft, but also just through taxation. Whereas individuals who have government connections, those are the individuals who benefit from the big government. So either you engage in voluntary exchange, everybody benefits in that case, or you have a system where the system dictates that some people are taken from, other people are the beneficiaries. In that type of system, the people who end up as beneficiaries are the people who have the connections to government. Now, one of the things that we did in looking at the issue of cronyism, I mean, people look at the faults of capitalism. They'll cite a whole bunch of faults of capitalism. And capitalism really is the economic system that is attached to liberalism. So if you have a liberal society, a free society, capitalism is the economic system that underlies that. So if you don't have a liberal system, that means that some people are in a position to take from others, and it always comes down to whoever is an insider, whoever has the connections with government, those are the people who are in a position to be the takers. And one of the things we did is to look at the way actual economic and political systems have worked. So you can talk about the ideals of socialism, but we went back and actually looked at the historical accounts. How did things work in the Soviet Union? You can talk about a government-directed economy, whether we're talking about fascism in Nazi Germany or industrial policy in modern Japan or modern Korea. You can talk about how that might work. But if you look at the way it actually does work, the insiders benefit at the expense of people who are outside. So what that leads to is people on the outside, if they're entrepreneurial and ambitious, they try to look for ways that they can become cronies.
Wow, that is such a good, succinct overview, and it reminds me of a couple of different things. When I lived in a rural agricultural area in the Soviet Union, there was a gentleman who was a farmer, and he was explaining to me how in the 70s he grew illegal watermelons. And I had never heard those two words put together, illegal watermelons. And these were simply watermelons that weren't grown on his personal plot. They were grown somewhere up in the hills that relied on, good rain. And he sold them. And if it wasn't for people like him, there would have been mass starvation, particularly for those that weren't insiders as you defined them. And it reminds me of something I read recently about how loopholes in that way, I would define his illegal watermelons perhaps as a loophole, were the breathing holes for freedom in such a cronyistic, economy. It's other examples too. I remember hearing that police officers actually would pay $50,000, and their family would take out loans and pool their resources to get, a young man and their family a position on the police force, and they would then have a certain responsibility to pay a certain amount to their superiors. But it was almost like buying into an annuity in terms of getting that insider status. And to me, that was just an astounding thing to learn, but it was really eye-opening. And I'm sure that you've come across examples of this, not just in the former Soviet Union. Certainly this existed during the Soviet Union, and to a degree, I think it happens even in first world companies. It's just, or countries rather, it just slightly different in its construct, I imagine.
Sure. Well, I mean, you look at what goes on in the United States. You go back a couple of years to the Occupy movement, and of course, I mean, one of their big complaints, they talked about the 1% who are profiting at the expense of the 99%. Well, if you think about that, and it started on Wall Street with the Occupy Wall Street. Well, think about what happened with the bailouts that occurred a couple of years ago. And sure enough, the big banks got bailed out, the big financial firms got bailed out, while individuals are being kicked out of their homes. And the people who were getting the bailouts, they were the cronies. So you have, the principals at Goldman Sachs, who are already pretty well off, but they're also pretty well connected. And so as a result, they profit at the expense of everyone else. So we see examples like that in the United States all the time. And in that sense, I'm pretty sympathetic with the Occupy movement, or at least what they're complaining about. But where I differ with them is where they see the solution. That too often people will look at that kind of thing and they'll say, we need more government regulation. We need, a new government program. We need more government oversight. But government isn't the solution to that problem. Government is the cause of the problem. The reason you have this cronyism is because of government. So too often people see these problems, and a lot of times I'll agree with them on the problems, but then they think the solution is more government. They don't see that it's the government itself that's caused the problem. If we didn't have the government to bail out those financial firms, you wouldn't have had the cronyism, you wouldn't have had those problems, you wouldn't have had the Occupy movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is sometimes hard to explain, and it kind of almost goes back to the misunderstanding or lack of understanding just about debt creation, money printing, and what a bailout means vis-a-vis the 99% and anywhere in that spectrum of what it means to be in the 99%, or an outsider versus an insider, someone who doesn't get a bailout. What does it mean to your store of wealth? And I often find that is sometimes the best way to approach someone. I certainly don't know all the answer, but someone who's sort of ignorant at looking at the fact that the solution isn't more government. As you said, the government got us into this mess, is simply to ask the question, do you know what a dollar is? And do you know how it's made? Would you recommend, certainly it would take more than 2 minutes in an elevator speech, but when you do have, what would you say to someone who would have been protesting in New York, if you had, a minute or two to perhaps shed light on what their argument is, and perhaps refocus their attention on something more constructive than simply saying that all banks should shut down and there should be price controls or something like that?
Yeah, I think the message I would try to impart to them is pretty much what I just said to you a minute ago, that they're protesting against the government's doing this, the government's doing that, so the government should shut down the banks, or the government should have more regulations and so forth. But really what they're protesting is what the government's already done. If the government is the cause of the problem, it's not the solution.
Right. One of the other pieces of work that I've been going through, and I think it's a subject of some of your scholarship, is how you do go forward with analyzing factors in an entrepreneurial and innovative economy. What are some of the factors that you would want to see improved, not only in the U.S., but certain indicators that you would want to be the subject of an analysis that perhaps aren't as much now?
Well, if you're looking at public policy, I think that the real key is to get the government out of the way of productive activity. That the government does serve a valuable role in protecting property rights. It serves a valuable role in establishing rule of law. Now, there are market alternatives to those things, so I'm not even suggesting we need to rely heavily on government, but that's one of the things that government actually does do for us, is to protect property rights, establish rule of law, so that we have an environment where people can engage in economic exchange for their mutual benefit. And the government's gotten much more heavily involved in that in the economy, and that I see as a problem. So if we limit the scope of government to protecting property rights, establishing rule of law, and then just let the market work to produce the prosperity that we enjoy so much, really I think the answer is limited government, and that's where we end up producing our prosperity.
Yes. One of the papers that you've written recently was something about the value-added tax. It was a couple years ago. And there's been a lot of talk about that when it comes to, simplifying the tax code, perhaps that being somewhere along the road of trying to reestablish a limited government. What are your thoughts on how a VAT, value-added tax, could be introduced in the United States, and should it be, or could it be, and what would be the least worst effective way to do it?
Yeah, there are a lot of little nuances to that question, and the bottom line for me right now is that the value-added tax is not a good fit for the United States. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is states already have sales taxes that tax the same tax base. And if you look at the countries that have value-added tax, none of the EU countries that have value-added taxes have sales taxes. The taxes tax the same tax base. And the fact that states rely on sales taxes is one factor. But another factor is that if we added a value-added tax to the tax structure that we already have, it would just generate a lot more tax revenue, and that would leave the door open to larger and larger government. So the value-added tax is not a good fit for the United States, and so I'm very willing to speak out against it. Now, if it came down to replacing our income tax with a value-added tax, that would seem to me to be a better trade. But that's not the trade-off that we're facing. Nobody's proposing doing away with the income tax. So given that we have an income tax, my view is that the value-added tax is unambiguously undesirable for the United States.
Well, currently you're residing in Florida and talking about government intervention and trying to find those that study equilibriums. Certainly, the Federal Reserve's intervention with the $85 billion a month QE that's going on, the artificially low interest rates that have somewhat breathed another life into the housing bubble in places like California, Nevada, and Florida, have been hot and cold as the business cycle has ebbed and flowed. What are some of the ramifications of the current Federal Reserve policy on Florida's housing market and economy in general over the next couple of years?
Well, I think really to look at that question fully, you need to look back and see what the Federal Reserve's policy did to the housing market in Florida over the last decade. When the Federal Reserve holds interest rates artificially low, what that does is distort one of the most important prices in the economy, which is the interest rate. If you go back a decade or so ago, when the economy was languishing in a little bit of a recession, one of the things I heard in the financial news a lot of times was the only thing that's really keeping the economy from collapsing is the housing market is holding up so well. But the reason the housing market was holding up so well was the Federal Reserve was keeping interest rates artificially low. So when you're buying a house, you look at what are my monthly payments going to be. So you're probably going to have to borrow to buy the house. What are my monthly payments going to be? And the lower the interest rate, the lower your monthly payments. So what that does is increase the demand for housing. And we see in several of the states you mentioned, California and Florida are especially interesting cases. We saw the big housing bubble. One of the characteristics that Florida and California share in common is they had very restrictive land use policies, so it's very difficult to build new housing. And as a result, the demand for housing went up, and that caused the price of housing to go up. It was an artificial bubble that was created by the Federal Reserve. Now, another state that's interesting by comparison is Texas, where there are very little in the way of land use controls, and so there, new construction could take place in order to increase the supply of housing. You didn't see housing prices go up in Texas the way you did in California and Florida, where the government had other restrictions on the market. So really what happened was the housing bubble was caused by Federal Reserve policy, and then when demand fell, prices fell way back down, probably to where they would have been otherwise. But you had a lot of people that suffered some financial distress because of the breaking of the housing bubble. Well, so then you asked about current Federal Reserve policy, and what we see is by keeping interest rates low, the Federal Reserve is creating what you might think of as an artificial recovery in housing. People talk about the housing market recovering, but really a lot of that is artificial and caused by the Federal Reserve.
Well, in breaking that down to somebody who is not aware of Austrian economic, business cycle theory, you have a rich collection body of work. I particularly like your listing and looking forward to reading 15 great Austrian economists. What are some of, including your own books, some initial works that you would recommend to folks just first studying the concepts that you and I have discussed in this interview today?
Well, that's a good question, and maybe it depends on how deeply that you want to get into things. I will start out by plugging a book of mine that will be out next year, which is called An Advanced Introduction to the Austrian School of Economics. The book's already been written. It's with the publisher, so that will be published sometime next year. I think Friedrich Hayek's work is very insightful. A lot of that is collected. He has a collection of essays called Individualism and Economic Order, which I would recommend. If you're interested in getting into understanding the Austrian theory of the business cycle and Austrian macroeconomics, a little more of an advanced book, but Roger Garrison has a nice book titled Time and Money, and I would recommend that also. And then there are some staples of Austrian economics. Murray Rothbard's book, Man, Economy, and State, and Ludwig von Mises's book, Human Action, are a couple that when people start getting interested in the Austrian school, eventually they'll come around to those books, so I might recommend them as well.
Well, thank you. That's an incredible first collection. I've heard of all of those pieces. I've been trying to get through Human Action. I think it takes a commitment to have it by my bedside and make it my permanent bedside reading for about a year to get through. Well, the subject of this podcast is how I have seen Austrian economics play a role in my understanding of health, and also just being able to understand a decentralized way of looking at the world from an awareness mindfulness perspective, other than just, of course, teaching economics and looking at all of the comparative analyses from the different schools of thought, and also being a researcher. What other facets of life has the understanding of economics, particularly Austrian economics, given you great benefits in how you conduct your life and your personal relationships, that you might conduct yourself a different way, or maybe a more joyous and fulfilling way because of your scholarship of these things?
Well, I'm not sure my answer is really going to play into Austrian economics, but maybe a sort of a philosophy of life that's related to Austrian economics. But if you start with the ideas of liberalism and the ideas of a market economy, I try to engage everybody through voluntary exchange. I try to look for ways in which I can interact with people for our mutual advantage. And I tend not to obsess about the fact that maybe I could be more charitable, maybe I could be more looking out for other people's interests. I mean, the way I look out for other people's interests is to think what's in our mutual advantage. So in that sense, I'm living my life trying to get my own advantages in life, but not by taking from other people, but rather by looking for ways that I can interact with other people where both of us are better off.
Well, that's a fantastic way to lead one's life. Dr. Holcombe, thank you very much for the conversation. Do you have anything else to add that perhaps we didn't cover in our discussion?
Oh, I think we've covered quite a bit, Zachary. I mean, there's always more things we could say, but I think we at least had a pretty good conversation to introduce people to some of the ideas of Austrian economics.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate your time. I will be putting all of the links for Dr. Holcombe's books, where he could be found on the Mercatus Center, his Florida State pages. Dr. Holcombe, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Zachary. I enjoyed having the opportunity to talk with you.
And that was Dr. Randall Holcombe out of Florida State University. At this time, please check us out on the3as.com. Sign up for our newsletter. Check us out on Twitter. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. And, of course, check us out on iTunes and subscribe to the 3As podcast. Till next time, take care.